بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد. So over here we had talked about the stages of development, and the first stage of the development of the hadith sciences we said it started with who? Even before. Yep. Okay, even before. We said like this initial idea of narrating, where did it begin? It was during the Prophet's lifetime. You remember when he gave permission to narrate, Umar radiallahu anh, he went to go see him to make sure, because people had to confirm that he had divorced his wives. So he asked the Prophet ﷺ, can I tell the people? And he ﷺ said, yes. So these are actually the first types of narrations. Even badal wahi, even when the revelation first started, he sallallahu alayhi wasallam, he had told Khadija, and then do we have any narrations from Khadija? No, right? Why? Because this idea of narrating hadn't really formed or solidified, but a lot of those narrations, they come from Aisha. So is it possible that she was there? Yeah, at the beginning of Revelation? No, absolutely not. So if we understand that, like this idea of relaying information and relaying the stories and the formation of Islam and the early parts of it happened during the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and a little bit, some of it was under his tutelage, right? So some of it was under his direction, ﷺ, and he used to allow them to actually write. So here we had said that the Prophet ﷺ, when he talked about khayrun nas qarni, in this hadith sahih, he said the best of people is my generation, then the next, and the next, right? And then he sallallahu alaihi wasallam stopped there. And why is that hadith important? Because it actually helps us define some of these stages. Yes, go ahead.
Does not that conflict when you said don't write everything that I say, so people would more memorize the Quran rather than
Then the hadith?
The hadith,
yeah. So I'm saying like that's one of the explanations, which is why I feel that the hadith it's not something that you actually ascribe to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. It's something that the companion said about himself. Yeah. So this is something that's really important. Like this delineation of these three generations is something that helps us when we talk about the stages of development of hadith. Because hadith, like we said, it started in a very basic sense during the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and then as time went further on, you started having more hadith, you started having more narrations. Why do you think that is? Yeah. So like as we continue, like if we go down the timeline, the chains are few and they're small and they're short. And then as you keep going down, you have more and more chains. It's like you get,
So during the Umar, he kept them together, but after he passed away, they all split.
Right. So a lot of, but the question then comes is like, okay, why? Why do you have few narrations during the times of the Prophet ﷺ? And then why is it like, you guys ever seen ice freeze? Yeah. Right, so it's like it freezes and it's like it starts like branching out in like a million directions. Would you say that's a good representation of how hadith spread?
I would say yes. The reason for it is perhaps at the time people didn't think it was important to preserve.
Right. So and why? Why is that?
Because
the Prophet is there. Right, he's alive. So what would you need to preserve while he was there? And not just that. So I want to give you guys a little bit of context, like on the mentality of the companions. Even when he sallallahu alaihi wasallam died, what happened? What did Umar do?
He kept everyone together. Yeah?
No, he actually didn't believe it.
He didn't believe it. He said he didn't believe it.
Whoever said that.
Whoever said I'm going to what?
I'm going to fight him.
Right? Yeah. I'm going to kill them.
Yeah. No.
He said just anybody say he's dead. Say he's dead. Why? So here. Did they believe the Prophet ﷺ was human? Yeah, right. As a whole, they did. Like, what was the problem?
He was shocked. It was difficult to lose someone they loved.
So it was definitely difficult. But when does difficulty come?
After he passes away.
Not just after he passes away. That's going to be for sure, right? The greatest calamity that this ummah ever faced was the death of the Prophet ﷺ. There's no doubt about that. But the question then comes is like, okay, why did so many of the companions, and Umar in specific, react in this way? Like if they knew he was human, and they knew he was going to die, why react in that way?
It's not
He loves him.
I definitely agree with all that. But what do you think they imagined about his lifetime?
He would live long.
That he would live for a long time. Not just live a long time. They assumed that he would live beyond
beyond
their lifetimes. And when he died, because what happens, like the higher we set our expectations, what happens? The harder. Right. The higher we set our expectations, the harder. It hurts that much more. So when you're constantly around the Prophet ﷺ, and I don't mean to say this in a negative way, but if somebody's always around, you tend to take that person for what? For granted. And like I said, I don't think they did it in a negative way, because all of the information we have about the Prophet ﷺ is from where? It's from them. You know what I mean? It was from them. So we can't say, did they waste their time with the Prophet ﷺ? No, clearly not. Clearly not. They're always trying to benefit from him. They're always trying to learn from him. They're always trying to better themselves, right? Like you have this constant drive of wanting to be around him and benefiting from him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. You know what I mean? So it's not like they were wasting their time around him, or they were trying to waste his time, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He was a great prophet, no doubt, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but there were also great companions. And they were great support for him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He loved them, right? He loved them. And how many other prophets historically can make that same claim? Right? Not too many. Not too many. Many of them were they had like an adversarial relationship with some of their people, and some of them had good support, right? You know, but the Prophet ﷺ, he was unique in the sense that he had better support than any of the prophets that preceded him.
It says that there's 100 stages in life. The Prophet ﷺ passed all of them. He was a father, a general, or a military leader, a husband, father was, like you say, Isa alayhi salam was. Yeah. He didn't marry. He wasn't a father. So the number of roles that he ﷺ had was significantly more than any other prophet that preceded him. For sure. Mashallah, that's a great observation, actually. And he had multiple roles, right? He had multiple roles. He had a role as a statesman, as a father, as a husband, as a grandfather. You know, I mean, like, you know, there's so many things that he experienced. He was an orphan too.
And he was an orphan. He can relate, poor or rich. Yep. I mean, the money flowed, so he still. When money came, it didn't matter. The money coming to him was the same as the money not coming. Right? There's just no.
And so that's why probably more people could relate to him. That's why you had different types of sahabas.
You had extremely wealthy companions, and you had extremely poor ones. You know, and nobody felt out of place around him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because he could relate to all of them. So, you know, and so this idea that him passing away, it was just so, you know, they felt so close to him, and they felt like, you know, he would be someone who'd always be part of their life. So the moment he passed, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it was just that much more damaging to their expectations. So the era of the Tabi'in, we had talked a little bit about this last time, in that their teachers were who? The Sahaba, right? Their teachers were the companions. And the companions, because they were their teachers, they instilled this love and respect for the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And what is unique about the era of the companions is that this is the first generation that actually didn't what? Didn't meet the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So right, so this is now we've entered an era of pure narration. Right? There's no eyewitness account anymore. Now it's just pure narration that's going forward and reaching them. And with that, you have a lot of things that are going on. Right? People have all of a sudden the rise of ulterior motives. Right? Whether they be political, sectarian, religious, whatever the reasons are, you know, this is where you have a rise in those generations. And when you have a rise of ulterior motives, all of a sudden what can happen to narrations?
They're gonna say it in a way that
right? There can be fabrications, there can be misunderstandings, right? And when you have more chains, there are more chances for mistakes, right? You know, these are all just very natural rises that are going to happen and come along. So chains of narrations began to lengthen. many of the companions, they were dying off now, right? So you've entered an era like, I think the year 70 is where you had like a huge number of companions like start to die off. But like, Aisha, I think she died year 50. Then Ibn Abbas, like he died year 60. And then like, so like you had major companions passing away. Anas, the last of the major companions to die, he died like 79 or 80. So within that time frame, you have like the death of so many major companions. And that knowledge is, it was lost with them. So Muhammad ibn Sirin, he says something very famous during this time. He said, this knowledge is religion, so took to who you take your religion from. So if he was born 110, we would assume he lived how long?
If he was born in 110.
I mean, he was died in 110, I'm sorry.
Like maybe 60?
Right, so he maybe 60, 70 years or so. So, we would say that he was born probably around the year 50. And so if by the time he was like 16 years old, he still was able to what? Catch?
Most.
Right, if not most, at least some of the companions were still there. So these are a few new sciences that began to form, and we had talked about these last time, is narrator criticism and narration criticism. What's the difference between these two?
Narrator criticism is they're criticizing the actual person,
good.
who he is,
yes.
meaning if he's righteous, if he's
yes. Absolutely.
If he's precise, but when they criticize narration, they're trying to find that illa or the mistakes.
Good, right? It could be the illa, or it could be the text of the hadith itself, right? Because remember, we had said that you can have a sound chain that leads to a rejected hadith. Muṣṭalaḥ al-ḥadīth. So now you actually, because you're dealing with specific problems and issues, what do? You use specific terminology to represent those problems and issues. Because does it make sense to explain the same problem over and over again? Or you just kind of come up with a term to kind of label it and make it easy for everyone to understand? Yeah, it makes it just makes it easier, right? And not just that, now that you have special terminology, and this happens in every field, the moment you have special terminology in a field, what happens?
Just by saying one word, they already understand the whole,
right.
The back.
Yeah, and so now you have a group of people who understand and a group of people who don't. Right? And this is very naturally, this is where you start having a split between the scholars and the lay Muslim. And then Tadween al-Sunnah, because now it is in this era, it's in this era that you have the first state-sanctioned order to compile the Sunnah. What does that mean?
State order, you said?
Yeah.
It means Khalifa or the...
Yeah, so the Khalif...
or Jada or... I guess.
Yeah, so you actually have during this era, one of the Khalifa, he orders Imam al-Zuhri, he says, compile the Sunnah. Compile the statements of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And this is, does this mean that it wasn't happening independently?
Wasn't happening?
Yeah. No, right? So it definitely, because usually governments are what?
Late.
They're usually late to the game, right? Why? Because there's bureaucracy, right? So whenever you have layers of bureaucracy, and by the time the government gets there, it's like, like most of the work is already done. Like they just come for the the signing or the cutting the ribbon. They're like, hey, look what we did, huh? Or like one piece of the cake. And why? Could this have been because the Khalifa was righteous? Definite possibility. Could it be because he was trying to catch the wave and get some recognition? Possibly. Allahu A'lam. Like I said, I think it's silly of us to look back on our history like in this romantic way, our political leaders are so great and righteous, and no, bro, they really weren't. So Tadween al-Sunnah. Tadween means to come and bring together. Or I'm sorry, to write. So you say dawwana shay is when he actually writes it down. This is very different to how we deal with the Quran. We don't call it Tadween al-Quran, right? We don't talk about writing down or authoring like the same way we do with the Sunnah. So authoring the Sunnah versus authoring the Quran. Why? Because it's ilahi, right? It's divine, right? So here it's from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's why it can't be authored in the same way. And not just that, here in the hadith corpus, you have different books, right? So you have Kitab al-Zakat, Kitab al-Sawm, Kitab al-Jihad, Kitab al-Raqa'iq, heart softeners, all of these different chapter headings. Do you have similar chapter headings for Quran? No. Why? Because the order Not necessarily the surah order, but at least the order of the verses, those are from who? Those are from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And is it possible to have 5 verses talking about 5 different topics? Yeah, you can, right? You can have 5 different verses talking about 5 different topics. But because the Prophet ﷺ, his speech, is there like a beginning, middle, end? Or sometimes do we find something here, and then sometimes something over here, and sometimes something over here?
On his speech, not
not on the Quran.
Yeah.
So with the Prophet ﷺ, we'll find different things at different times in different places. And what happens is, how did the scholars put these things together? How did they start organizing it? We'll talk about that, inshallah. So during the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ, we have the hadith of Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As. He said, I used to write everything I heard from the Prophet ﷺ that I had intended to memorize. Also, Abu Hurairah, there was no one from the companions of the Prophet who had more hadith than me except Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As. Why? Because he used to write and I didn't. Also, Abu Hurairah, he says, an Ansari man complained to the Prophet ﷺ about his inability to memorize, so he told him, take the aid of your right hand, i.e., write it down. At Fatih Makkah, conquest of Mecca, a man came to the Prophet ﷺ asking the Prophet ﷺ to write his sermon for him. The Prophet ﷺ agreed and said, write for Abu Shah.
So, question on that second
Yes.
hadith of Abu Hurairah.
Yeah, this one?
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
he wouldn't write, so his hadith, or what he's trying to say is the meaning versus, the actual.
No, not necessarily.
And so,
Not necessarily.
back to the time
Because Abu Hurairah was a great what? He was a great memorizer, right? Abu Hurairah was a great memorizer. So for him, we could, are there some things that are possible that he narrated by meaning? Yeah, I think so. But his precision is going to be what we expect from his precision is going to be more than other companions. And why is that? The Prophet ﷺ actually made a special dua for Abu Hurairah. So he said, "Yeah, Abu Hurairah, put out your shirt." So he put out his garment like this, and he said, "I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow you to memorize everything that you hear from this day." And he said, Ameen, and then he took it and he wrapped it in himself like this. He said, from that day, I never forgot anything. Yeah.
I did not heard that one. But
Yeah. So I mean, amazing, man. Like these dudes, man. Actually, like subhanallah, these companions, they're just like amazing human beings, and the efforts that they made in memorizing and retaining the sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Hadith Rafi ibn Khudayj. What else can we benefit from these hadith? What can we learn?
That actually they were taking notes. They were already writing.
That writing had already begun. That writing had begun during the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And if we understand that writing had begun, and not just writing had begun, if we look at these hadith, what was the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's attitude toward writing? He encouraged it, right? So not only did he allow it, he actually encouraged it. When people would ask him, he would tell them, write it down, record it. This is not a problem. When somebody asked him, he said, write it down for him and give it to him.
Khalifa was way late.
Listen, I told you, governments are always late. Hadith Rafi ibn Khudayj, I hear many things from you, Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Should I write it down? He said, there is no issue in writing it. Giving him permission. The Prophet ﷺ had a book written concerning charity, debts, obligations, and sunan for Amr ibn Hazm. He asked him, and he said, listen, just give me something that I can act on. So today, what are some things that we use? We use like fiqh primers, right? Like it'll be a very simple text in fiqh that'll tell us how to do, look at all of these things. Charity, debts, obligations, sunan, right? These are all things that we normally would want for fiqh. Sunan are like, the extra good deeds that an individual can do. And he sallallahu alaihi wasallam had it written on his deathbed. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, bring a notebook so I can dictate for you a book in the hopes that you will not be misguided after me. And who wrote it? Did he write it himself? No, because the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was unlettered. Yeah, he was unlettered. The agreements that the Prophet ﷺ dictated to the Muhajirin and the Ansar and between the Muslims and the Jews. All of these, again, are recordings that happened during the life of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So there are specific narrations on Abu Bakr, Umar, and Ibn Mas'ud that they all had compilations in the form of books but erased them. And why did they erase them? It's the same thing that we had spoken about before. They would fear that the people would abandon the Quran and busy themselves with the Sunnah. Abu Bakr, he wrote to Anas ibn Malik the obligatory charity that he had heard from the Messenger of Allah. It should be he, I'm sorry. Umar ibn Khattab wrote to Utbah ibn Farqad some sunan. Ali had a parchment that he used to keep tied to his sword, saying that a Muslim should not be killed for a disbeliever. And again, do you imagine these to be like huge compilations and huge books? Not really, right? And why is that? Remember, you guys had already answered this before. Why was the Sunnah not actively written and compiled during the life of the Prophet ﷺ? Because he was there, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And it's the same reason that the Quran was not compiled, right? Because he was still alive. Even though he sallallahu alaihi wasallam actually had dedicated scribes, even though they didn't necessarily even though they didn't write everything down. So some of the early collections. These are some of the early collections that had existed. Now, what happens to these collections going forward historically? You guys know? They become incorporated into larger books, right? They become incorporated into larger books. From them, the collections of Sa'ad ibn Ubadah, the collection of Abdullah ibn Abi Awfa, the text of Sumra ibn Jundub, Abu Rafi', he was a servant of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, concerning the opening supplication of the prayer. Abu Huraira's collection with Abu Musa al-Ashari, he has his own collection, the collection of Jabir ibn Abdullah al-Ansari. So again, not something that was strange, but were they a lot, were they many, were they long compilations? No, not particularly. And then you have here, this is called the sound collection of Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As. It was as-Sahifa as-Sahiha, right? So it's called the sound collection of Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As. Imam Ahmed, he narrates it completely in his Musnad. So what happened is that this collection, in this small collection of hadith, what happens? It gets incorporated into a larger work later on. The collection of Abi Salama, Nabit ibn Sharit al-Kufi, the sound collection of Hammam ibn Munabbih, who narrated on Abu Hurairah. So here, what do you guys think about this timeline? Is it realistic? Is it possible?
72 years?
So if we assume he'd have to be at least 15 to narrate.
Oh man, that's not it.
It's a stretch, right? It's a little bit of a stretch.
If you kind of consider back then, they matured relatively.
No, that's what I'm saying. Even if we assume he's 15.
Consider adult back. I mean, not adult. He should be.
He had to have been like 90 when he died.
Yeah. So he'd have to have been extremely old when he passed away. And there is some kalam about this collection in particular, but this doesn't negate all of the hadith works. Right? It doesn't negate all the hadith works. It's just something important to be wary of. So even though you have this culture of hesitation to write, right? There is a permission, but there's still some hesitation to write, right? Because they're still want to compile the Quran. They took the religion as a responsibility. And even if they didn't write things down, when people would ask them, how would they respond?
So last time, if I'm not mistaken, when someone or something would affirm, you gave an example of when someone came and asked, asked that little kid. And known that.
Sure. So they affirmed a hadith, they corroborated a hadith, that's for sure, no doubt about that. Saying that, when somebody would ask a companion, and just imagine, like, if we're tabi'een, we go up to a companion and we ask him a question, what is the manner in which that companion is going to respond? If I say, Shaykh, what is the ruling on this? How do you think that they would respond? Would they just respond with like a halal and haram? Possibly, but more often than not, what do we find in the books of narrations? We have explanations. And what are those explanations? Where do they come from? From the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So they would be asked questions, and they would usually respond with a prophetic statement, or they would respond with a prophetic action. I was with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The same thing happened to me when I was with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he did X, Y, Z. The first hadith we took in Sahih Muslim, right? You have two tabi'een asking Ibn Umar, well, what do you say about qadr? What do you say about divine pre-decree? And how does he answer? That my father told me the story that he was sitting with the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and a man came to him, and he asked him about Islam, he asked him about Iman. That was not uncommon. To see these interactions where you have tabi'een, where you have students of companions going to companions with questions, and the companion is answering in the form of a hadith.
As they were a witness, or
yeah, I mean, either they witnessed it directly or they were told, right? So you have two very famous companions who take a lot of these second-hand stories. Ibn Umar being one. Why? Because he was young. And the second young companion was who? It was the Prophet ﷺ's nephew, Ibn Abbas. Ibn Abbas, he took a lot of his narrations from other companions. And he was actually more so a student of Umar than he was any of the other companions. Ibn Abbas was Abbas's son. So they were first cousins. They weren't nephews. Yeah. So they had this hesitation here, right? They had this hesitation, but saying that they had academic integrity and they had academic honesty, that they would not hide knowledge, because there is a prophetic warning against that. What is that warning? Whoever hides knowledge, then what? This is a very famous hadith. Listen, if there are any hadith you should know, this is one of them. Huh? Right, they wear a yoke from the yoke of the hellfire.
One of the Sahabas, when he was passing away, said, he was the one who left about the la ilaha illallah, whoever said it.
Yeah, dakhal al-jannah, yeah.
If he said that when he was passing away, if I didn't believe it,
I would be held accountable to this hadith. Yeah, absolutely. So for them, it was like it was a spiritual motivation for them to narrate. Why? Because they feared hiding something, and the only time they would speak is if they feared other people weren't going to say something about that. Also, they were ready to put their lives in danger. Abu Dhar, he said, I would continue narrating even if somebody held a sword to my neck. He said, I don't care. I'm not scared. I'm going to narrate. And Abu Dhar, it was like one of the hardest companions. Like, you get, so subhanAllah, man, he goes to Egypt with his wife, and he's dying, and he tells his wife, he's like, go ahead, go. And she's like, what do you mean go? He's like, the Prophet ﷺ said that I was born alone, and I will be raised alone. So go ahead. Some travelers came across him, they buried him, they prayed his janazah on him, and this is how he died. That's how he died, radiyallahu anhu. So I believe him when he says this. so if he says that I will continue narrating even if it's short, he went to Damascus, and he went to Muawiyah, and he goes to him, he's like Muawiyah, what's the ruling on men wearing bangles? Muawiyah was like, it's haram. He's like, what's the ruling on men wearing silk? He was like, it's haram. He's like, what's the ruling on wearing a predator's skin, like a lion's skin or something like that? So so Muawiyah was like, it's haram. He's like, why do I see all that stuff in your house then? So he got kicked out of Damascus, and then when he was going back to Medina, he remembered the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ saying that, yeah, Abu Dhar, if you get kicked out of Medina, what are you going to do? He's like, I'll travel north. And he ended up in Damascus. He said, what if you get kicked out of there? He said, I'll come back to Medina. He said, what if you get repelled from entering Medina? He said, I'm going to fight them. He said, I'm going to take my sword out. And he said, no, you're not. He said, you're going to go stay outside. And he actually lived, and he spent the end of his life before he traveled outside of Medina. Radiyallahu anhu. If they feared a hadith not being narrated, then they would narrate. So this hadith, Mu'adh ibn Jabal, the same one you narrated, the same one that you told us, that whoever makes a testimony, he says that whoever says La ilaha illallah dakhal al-jannah, that whoever says La ilaha illallah will enter paradise. And he said, the only reason I'm narrating this hadith is because the Prophet ﷺ told me when we were alone, and I fear that if I don't tell you before I die, then no one else will narrate this hadith. So again, it was a spiritual responsibility that they actually carried on their shoulders, and they took it very seriously. So here, the first organized effort to collect hadith of the Prophet ﷺ was from Abdulaziz ibn Marwan, and he was the governor of Egypt, and he ordered to collect hadith. So he wrote to Kathir ibn Murrah al-Hadrami, and why did he write to Kathir? Because Kathir meant 70 Badris. What does that mean? Yeah. I'm sorry? I mean, you never know until you... What, you guys ever heard the Wayne Gretzky quote? You miss 100% of the shots you don't take? Yes, they're the companions of Badr, right? So 70 Badris, these are 70 companions who fought at the battle of Badr. And so does it make sense that he would write him a letter? Or no? Yeah, absolutely. So he told them, collect all the hadith he had heard from them, save the hadith of Abu Hurairah. Except, don't collect the hadith of Abu Hurairah. Why? He already had it. So he already had Abu Hurairah's collection. He wanted a hadith that were not part of that collection. So we don't know what happened. So the request was made. Is it possible that he didn't listen? Yeah, right? It's definitely possible that he didn't listen to him. Tool and political ploy, and to show political power that I have these collection from the Prophet ﷺ. And if Kathir knew what his intention was, that would be motivation for him to what? To actually ignore the request. And was it uncommon for the scholars of hadith to ignore these requests?
No, I mean, it was common.
It was pretty common for them. They didn't involve themselves very often with a lot of government affairs. Many times you have a lot of stories in Muḥaddithīn actually trying to escape governors and escape some of these political figures because of the problems that they had and the issues that they had faced. So historically, it's actually really interesting. If you look at the power dynamic between the scholars and the politicians, you don't really have a time where they're they all really get along. There might be individual cases where individual politicians get along with individual scholars, but historically they haven't had a good relationship. And even today, many times people will judge a scholar because what? Whether he went to jail or not, right? Is he a real scholar? Did he go to jail? Okay, yeah, that's what makes a real scholar. This is something that's, again, it's not historically strange to have this problem, to have this issue. After him, so after Abdulaziz ibn Marwan, you had Umar ibn Abdulaziz. Umar ibn Abdulaziz, very famous tabi'i, right? A very famous tabi'i, or was he tabi'i? But anyway, he was a Khalifa for like a year, I think 2.5 years, from 99 to 101, something like that. He sent out multiple letters and requests requesting them to gather hadith. What can we say that's unique about Umar ibn Abdulaziz?
I was the best, one of the best Khalifas in that.
Right, he was actually religious.
Yeah, he was religious.
Right, he was actually religious. He was actually pious. He actually cared about the scholars.
It was said that people couldn't find him to give zakat at his time.
Yeah, because he was so just.
He was just.
He was extremely just. But again, he was only Khalifa for I think a year and a half or 2.5 years, something like that, for a very, very short period of time. I'm sorry?
What happened?
What happened? I have no idea. He might have been. He was probably poisoned. He was probably poisoned, man. So he passed away before the project was actually able to come into fruition. But again, you have these requests going out from these governors. You have a request going out from the Khalifa, and this gives us an idea culturally of what's happening, right? That these collections, and like we had said, these collections had already what? They had already started, right? They had already started. It's not like people were kind of sitting around and the Khalifa was like, hey, why don't we gather the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ? That's not what happened. Rozaq, Musannaf ibn Shayba. But what was going on in these books? Because it's important to understand there were cultural shifts that were happening, and people were compiling books in different ways. One of those ways was the Musannaf way. One of those ways was Sunan, already being gathered. There was another way also. that some of these books were being gathered, which is called the Musnad. And I believe that that's in the following generation. So from the most famous compilations, and I want you guys just to look at the areas here. What do you find?
Different regions.
They're all in different regions. They're all in different regions. Yes?
The 157 is the death year.
The death year. Yeah, all of these are the death years. Yeah, all of these are death years. Because Ibn Abi Dhib, and he was a contemporary of Imam Malik. Both of them are from Medina. Any questions on this? But these are the famous compilations that happened during this time. Yeah, go ahead. Huh? Yeah, they're very close. Very close. I mean, so the only two that were kind of a little bit off were Layth ibn Sa'd. Layth ibn Sa'd, he was actually Imam Shafi'i's teacher when Imam Shafi'i went to Egypt. Yeah. So this era was unique because not only hadith were being gathered, but also statements from the companions, also fatwa from some of the tabi'een. So now, these books were very long, right? These books were very long because they're not just hadith from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Even if you look at the Muwatta, not only is it hadith from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but he also includes some of his own fatwa. So these sunan, wars, tafsir, right, explaining this. You can flip narrators. Sometimes you can confuse the text. This is muttarib. Batil. Batil is also, it's a type of it's something, it can also be considered munkar. Ma la asl lahu, meaning that this is a baseless hadith. Someone just said it and they ascribed it to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Tadlis. You guys remember tadlis for the Muslim class? I spent like 2 classes talking about this. What is tadlis? They hide who? They hide the intermediary, ahsant, right? So they'll, instead of narrating directly from someone, they'll have somebody will be an intermediary, but they use an, right? They use on the authority of to hide that intermediary. And then talqeen. Talqeen is a way to narrate and to take a hadith. So where do these terms come from? All of them have a linguistic meaning, meaning that these are the closest words that represented an idea. And a word represents an idea even if there is some kind of connection to that. So for example, isnad. Isnad means, right? It means chain, right? And that chain was the closest thing that they felt represented what was happening in the narration. Irsal means overreach and extend. Why? Because the tabi'i is overreaching and extending over who? Who's he overreaching? He's saying the Prophet ﷺ said. So who is he overreaching?
He's skipping it
he's skipping a sahabi. He's skipping a companion. So do you guys see the linguistic connection to some of the terminological meanings here, or no? Does it make sense? I'll give you guys a second to read it again. I'm starting to lose you guys. I'm seeing a gloss in the eyes. It's just all words on the page now.
Okay, I got it.
Yes. Yeah. So. Yes. Yep. Absolutely. So and each person, what do they represent in this transmission? A chain. So in a chain, what is a unique characteristic of a chain? That is, right, that they're linked, right? So does that metaphor or that image does it make sense to the idea it's trying to create? And when in munqati' is break, where is the break? In the chain, meaning that there's a break in the chain that these two links are missing. They can't meet. Yes.
So a lot of us think hadith all isnad.
Yes.
So those are the ones that are all authentic because there's multiple people that
Absolutely.
prophecies.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So what would make it da'if? Is it just like one person, say, has the title that is saying that like the Prophet has narrated?
So there are multiple ways they can be weak. One of those ways is like if you have somebody who's narrating but his memory's not good, right? He's still connected and in the chain, but how strong is that link? Does it make sense? Or you have somebody who made a mistake, right? He said Abdurrahman ibn Mahdi, but he meant to say Abdurrahman ibn Khalid, right? So it becomes very easy to make these types of mistakes. So catching on to those mistakes, these are reasons for a weak hadith to be weakened. And you have multiple reasons for that. Now, what can strengthen a chain? If I have multiple chains, right? So if I have like 5 companions saying the same thing, and then their students all saying the same thing, and they're all corroborating, I can now rely on this hadith very, very comfortably. But if I have 3 companions saying 3 different things, right, this becomes a problem, because it's not possible that the companions would actually contradict one another. And we had talked about that, right? And the reason we can trust them is because Allah chose them. And the Prophet ﷺ also, like he reinforced that concept and reinforced that idea. So, I mean, these are all important points. But again, understanding the linguistic connection to these terms, it helps us understand why these istilahat, or why these terminologies became so important, why they became so popular. Because the idea is the strongest way to represent that. So if I have people connected to one another, what's a great way of representing that? Through the isnad. Because something that is musnad is something that I actually rely on. And if the sanad isn't strong, what's going to happen? It's going to fall apart.
I like the demonstration.
Thank you. I'm trying to. I mean, we're trying to be visual learners here. Yes.
It was tough.
Yeah.
It would be so authentic even
If it's mursal.
correct. Yeah.
Okay. So let's try to answer that question. If I have a tabi'i saying the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Yeah.
Okay,
Right.
I get it.
So interestingly enough, munqati' and mursal, these are used interchangeably. Why? This actually became more popular later on to be a specific type of inqita', right? To be a specific type of cut. But why do both of them work? Right, it makes sense, right? One is representing an overreach, right? You like as if you're skipping over somebody, and the other term is representing a break. But both of them show that there is actually a missing piece or a missing link. How is that missing link? It can be through overreach, or it can be missing altogether. Any questions? Yeah.
Is the overreach the tadlis?
No. Because overreaching is that you're now narrating on that person, and you never met them, or you never heard what it is that you're narrating from them.
Authority, that's what I was going to ask.
Yeah.
In the authority episode, when you say the authority, you're
Yeah.
skipping all this. That's what
Yeah. No, but it wouldn't be that, because you're not implying a connected chain. Does that make sense?
That was my question.
Yeah.
Like, it could be tadlis.
Yeah. No. It can't. Why? Because you're implying a connected chain. The thing is with inqita' or irsal, you're not even implying a connected chain. You're just skipping it altogether. So you have principles and maxims that are being laid out in order to help understand and how to deal with some of these asanid. The first person to actually put this, like Muhaddith al-Fasil is considered the first work. But I think Ram Hormuzzi, he came after Shafi. But the first person to actually put down some of these hadith terminology in a form that was digestible and readable and create maxims and create rules was Imam al-Shafi. Which is why it's not strange most of the Muhaddithīn were Shafi. There's very few who weren't. There were very few who weren't. And so we're talking about this 204, and now this leads us into the next age of compilation, which is known as the golden age of compilation. What do you think, what books were recorded in this time period or time frame? Ahsant. Right, so this is where you have the famous works that we actually refer to and utilize today being recorded. And we'll talk more about this inshallah next time, but this is where we are now. So now we've gone from the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We talked about some of the recordings during the time of the companions, how those were carried on to the tabi'een, and how then those collections started being incorporated into larger works. And then this next generation that we're going to talk about is, yes, there are some longer chains, but some of those shorter chains, they actually survived, and those become incorporated into these larger works. Any questions? No? خلاص. I'll see you guys inshallah after Salat al-Isha. We will have our tazkiyah class. Allahu a'lam. Wa sallallahu ala khayri khalqin. Nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi.